I was born in March 1929, and I was 10 years old when the war broke out. And I remember it completely as though it was yesterday, the day that it all happened. My mother's younger brothers were brought up as my brothers because my grandpa died at a very early age, and my mother was married and had me as a small child, and she took the youngest ones of my grannies because she'd had a stroke. So it was like a big family of 5 of us. And the 2 boys were both called up. Billy went at 21. They were all 21-year-olds were called up and put in bell tents in Arrow Park. Arrow Park is in Birkenhead. It's a great big park. And Chas was in the Territorial Army, so he was called up as well. So they both went before the war was declared. And the day the war was declared, we were all sitting listening to the radio. And my mother was so worried about the boys, and they both went throughout the war. Chas was in the RASC, which of course the logistics, and he drove a petrol tanker. He was a sergeant when he came out the war. And Billy drove a tank, a Churchill tank. They were both in Dunkirk, and they were both in El Alamein. They really did see the war out. Now, my brother Charlie was 6'6", and he always remembers Dunkirk quite well because his head was above water. That's all he always remembered. And he came home on the Kingory from Dunkirk, the Liverpool Isle of Man boat. So he always talked about the Kingory brought me home. But they both had, when I say good wars, they both came home. The war to me was excitement because, of course, we lived in Birkenhead quite close to the docks. So, of course, whenever there was an air raid, they aimed right for us. Now, we always knew when it was going to be a raid was due because my father would come pedalling home and say, get them in the air raid shelter. Well, we shared the air raid shelter with next door, Mrs. Roberts and her brother, Archie. But they never came in the Anderson shelter, so we had it to ourselves. But when they got a bit heavier, they started coming in. And we started having whistling bombs. Don't know whether you recall them at all. They used to come and they'd whistle and then they'd stop. And Archie, the brother, used to say, hush, hush. And Mrs. Roberts used to shout, duck. So they were known to us as hush and duck. I mean, they just only ever came in if it was bad. Now, I mean, we just went to bed in the Anderson shelter, and that was it. You know, you expected it. But then one night, my dad came home from work, and he said, Annie, get the kids down. It's going to be a bad night. We've got all the purple lights on. He worked on the dock board. He was an engineer. So my mother collected the eiderdowns off the beds, and we went down to the Mersey Tunnel, down to, not the Mersey Tunnel, the Mersey Railway Tunnel, Hamilton Square, and we sat on the floor of the platform. And I can remember the station master saying, come on, it's closing down now, you'll have to go. And my mother saying, we are not moving out of here until this raid is over. Well, it went on all night, it was the Blitz. And when we came out of the Mersey Railway, we had to walk home, there were no buses or anything. And when we got home, there was no home. It had gone, completely and utterly. Now, in that corner of where we lived here. My grandma lived back in onto us. You could go right through the 2-yard doors. My granny lived there. We lived here. My auntie lived, 2 aunties lived over the road from my granny, and one lived round the corner. And we were all bombed. We didn't have a brick standing anywhere. It was completely gone. And the people from the town hall came round and gave a name and address that we were to be billeted on, because we had no home, and we couldn't. And the dog was missing, so my father dug down all this debris to find the dog, and we found the dog, and he took it over to my uncle in Wallasey. And would you believe he lost it? It ran away. We never found her. But we were all bombed. There was my granny, Nell, Auntie Connie, Auntie Doris. We were all bombed out in one night. It was just bricks. So we were given this address where we were billeted on in Upton. And my father went out to see what it was all about. And the old woman put her head through the door and she said, "You're not coming in my house. I'm having no evacuees here. You can go." So she wouldn't let us in the house. So we came back and we had nowhere to go at all, only the air raid shelter in the backyard. Anyway, we took ourselves back down to the Mersey Tunnel, the railway tunnel. And there were hundreds of people there that night. There was only us the previous night. And there were hundreds of people walking around. Now, we had no food, we had nothing. And they opened up what they called British Restaurant. And they used to send a bus and take us down to this British restaurant. You'd get fed, and then they'd drive you back. And you just stood by the bricks. And the soldiers were digging for survivors on the other side of the road. Eventually, one of my father's friends arrived. And he said, "I've been looking for you all day." He said, "Come on, I'm going to take you home." And he took us to West Kirby. Very kind of them, but they had no beds. So we slept on the floor. And every time we got in a bath, you came out as black as you went in. It was engrined in us. We were there for about 6 or 8 months. There was no bombing there at all at West Kirby. But we eventually got a bungalow in Gronant in Wales. And we went there, and it was a cabin, a summer thing that we were living in. And on the sandhills. And every night the soldiers used to come and light big bonfires on the beach to guide the planes in, and they used to come along the coast and up the Dee or the Mersey. Well, we were there for about 6 months and we came back to Birkenhead because my father didn't like all the travelling to work and back every day. So we came back to Birkenhead. It was, I can't say it was exciting, but I suppose it was to us as children. I can remember rushing out of the shelter every morning, going looking for shrapnel, bits of shrapnel in the street. And overnight time, when the raid started, there'd be guns dragged along by lorries and parked on the end of the road. And, we were so near the docks, we were going to get it anyway. And then they got Tate & Lyle's sugar factory. So it went doom, They had lights everywhere. It lit the whole Liverpool and Birkenhead up. And then they got a landmine right on top of the gasometer. So that went up. And we were living amongst it all, We had nowhere else to go. And then my father, we got a house in Claughton Village, which was just outside of the main part of Birkenhead. And then we got a bomb on the 2 houses next door to us. It just seemed to follow us about. But to us as children, it was excitement. I can remember lots of things happening, sort of dragging us off. You never went to bed. You went to the air raid shelter. But we eventually got this house, the last house that my mother got in Haldane Avenue in Claughton Village. And so we were all right, we had a house. No furniture, but we had a house. And then you got utility tickets and you were able to buy second-hand furniture. But everything happened in that house. We had lots of happening. But we had a huge air raid shelter in the front room, and it was made of iron. It was like a great big table, and you climbed underneath it, and it was all wire, and you put these wire cages round it. My mother wouldn't get in it, so that was taken out, and they built us an air raid shelter in the back garden. Now, everything happened. The lads were away, both in Dunkirk, both in El Alamein. And, well, we just mucked in, kind of thing. Everybody just... And then my mother got another house for my granny and her sister. And then another sister got a house round the corner. So we were all back together in Claughton Village, which was... My mother and her sisters were as thick as, you know, kick one and they all fell over. But the lads used to come home on leave. But they came home on leave and there was no house. They went back to the old house and there was nothing there. And they went round looking for everybody because there were so many of us, so many uncles and aunts, and we'd all gone together in one night. It was a funny old world. The rationing was bad. We registered with the co-op, and the first man on the bacon counter, my father always said he was the first man on the bacon slicer, he got made a manager in a tatty old co-op shop down the town. And he said to my mother, "Can I take your ration books with me?" So our ration books went down the town to a tatty old co-op down Birkenhead. And he used to send us the order with the bread man, because the bread man used to come up past us and he'd bring the order. But we never could put an order in. We had to rely on what Bert would send us. So we didn't do bad. You know, we didn't do bad. Because he was in a tatty shop. The people didn't want the butter, they wanted margarine down there. So you'd sometimes get a bit extra butter, and so we were all right during the war. My mother used to bake. My mother could bake anything. And we had, I reckon, when I think about it now, that the food we got in those days did us far more good than the food we're getting. Because we've lived a long time, and all the others all died in the 50s and 60s. And I'm 88, and I feel still going strong. Well, I hope so.
What was school like?
Pardon?
What was school like?
School was not bombed. My school wasn't bombed. But the Catholic school over the road was bombed. So we used to do a day each. 1 week you'd have Monday, Wednesday and Friday, and the next week you'd have Tuesday and Thursday, because we had to share it with the Catholic school over the road. They had nothing. And then eventually we got 2 days a week, and then you got 3 days a week. Eventually they put cabins up, and the Catholic girls went over there, back to their old school. But there were cabins. Now, during the war, if you were in school and the air raid siren went, you had to grab your gas mask and your notebook and your reading book, and you go and sit in the corridors. Now, the corridors, when I think about it, was such a silly place, because as you went along the corridor, the classrooms were on either side, and they're only half brick, and the rest was glass. And we were sitting in the corridor. But worse than that, the corridor used to have a big sort of metal grill that ran along the corridor for heating. We used to have to go and sit in that corridor with your books, and you'd have mental arithmetic and all this sort of thing. We were sitting on top of the boilers. I mean, when you think about it, it was ludicrous. But we sat amongst the boilers. School was, well, it was all right. I don't reckon I had education. I reckon I had more education when I left school than I did ever at school, because the teachers had been called up and we had old ladies. But happy days. It was happy days. My mother wouldn't allow us to be evacuated because you had to stand in a hall when you were evacuated, and the people that were going to have you would come and choose one. And my mother wouldn't have that. So we went to Gronland, and my mother came with us, and she took a bungalow there. But my father objected to all the travelling, so we came back to Birkenhead, just in time to next door to be bombed out. But it was only a bomb, it wasn't a landmine, because there were landmines that were dropped on us. They just exploded, and one exploded, as I tell you, in the gasometer, and that was a tremendous fire. Uncle Vic used to come home. He was on the Duchess of Richmond, a merchant seaman. He'd been a sailor before the war, and he went back in the Merchant Navy. And he used to come home with a cardboard, wooden box, and it would be full of goodies, tomato ketchup, and tins of meat, and he'd bring, all his wages were spent on food to bring home. And he was on the Duchess of Richmond all through the war, and he wouldn't take a leave. He never took any leave because he didn't go back on the same ship, and he didn't want to leave. He was bosun on the Duchess. Now, she used to come into Liverpool, and my mother used to go across to Liverpool to collect his allowance because his wife, her mother's sister, worked in the co-op. So my mother used to go and get his wages, and he used to always go to the same little old man that used to give her the money, and he'd say, "You are going sailing on Friday night, aren't you?" And my mother would say, "Yes," because that was him telling us that the Duchess was coming in on Friday night. And so we used to take the ferry from Liverpool to New Brighton. Up and down we'd go, and then eventually you'd see the Duchess coming in and my Uncle Vic waving a broom, you know. And then, but he never took leave because you didn't go back on the same boat. You know, you could be put on a coaster. You know, you could be put on anything. So he never took leave because he was in Liverpool anyway, you know. But he used to bring us most wonderful boxes, tea chests, and a big hand of bananas. You know, we couldn't get a banana unless you had a green book. Now, green books were for children under the age of 5. And if they had any bananas, they went to them. But my Uncle Vic would bring you a big hand, green bananas. He was a wonderful person. But he sailed on the Duchess of Richmond right throughout the war, and she came home as good as gold. But one night, after the war, Uncle Vic came knocking on our front door, and he said to my husband, "Tony, can you take me to Liverpool?" And Tony said yes, because we had a car. So he took him to Liverpool, and Uncle Vic stood on the docks and cried. The Duchess of Richmond was on fire. But they changed her name after the war. They changed her name to the Empress of Britain. But she's the old Duchess. But she went on fire in Gladstone Dock. And my Uncle Vic just stood on the quay. And he was a big sailor man, you understand. But he sailed on her all throughout the war. And he was just upset. We had no clothes left, of course. We only had what we'd gone down to the tunnel in, which was a homemade pair of trousers that my mother had made, and a jumper. And you had nothing else. You had no more clothes. They were gone. Eventually they gave us extra coupons, clothing coupons, and we were able to buy a bit of a school uniform to go back to school. But I was only 13 when I left school. I was nearly 14, and you're allowed to leave within that area. So I left school at just gone, not quite 14. But I went to a commercial college, and I went to work in an office, Truman's Brewery. Do you know Truman's Beer? Truman Hanbury Books?
Indeed, yes.
Well, I went to work for them. And the dockers had gone on strike because there was no beer. And they came hammering on the doors when they were, you know, in the office, because the dockers were complaining there was no beer anywhere. So, yes, that was fun. And I left there and I went to work in Littlewoods, the Pools people. Now, Birkenhead had no work for women until Littlewoods came. There were factories in other towns, cotton mills and things, but we had nothing for women in Birkenhead. And once you married, you had to leave. They didn't employ married women, but during the war, of course, they did. And I went to work for Truman's, but my wages were appalling, absolutely appalling. So I left there and went to Littlewoods Pools, and it was an amazing jump in my money. But we managed. My mother took all your money off you anyway. You didn't get any. She took your packet and gave you a few shillings.
During the war, Auntie Lily got married.
Oh, don't tell them that.
Go on, tell about the wedding. What did you do? Because there was nothing for a wedding.
There was nowhere to go and you couldn't get anything, But my mother was very well in with quite a few of the... Anyway, my mother had to call in a few. So the wedding was at our house. So she bought a couple of trestle tables from the church and she called in a few favours. So the co-op manager gave her a big tin of ox tongue, a big tin of ox tongue. And she got a big piece of ham from the butcher man. We did very well. But there was no cakes. But my Uncle Fred worked at the co-op bakery. So he brought us a cake they'd made, just an ordinary currant bun thing. Anyway, they made a cardboard box that went over the cake, decorated. Do you understand?
Yes.
So we had this wedding at our house. So we'd done very well. And my Uncle Fred, working in the bakehouse, also brought us, I can remember it well, a big wooden tray with fancies on it. Fancies. For the wedding. So we did all right for the wedding. We had salad and stuff and that. But Wilf's mother, the fellow Lily was marrying, had been called up and he had been put in the Navy. And he'd been out in the Mediterranean for 2 years. I mean, he had a rotten war, Wilf, because he was on minesweepers escorting convoys into Malta. And he'd been in the Mediterranean for 2 years. So, of course, the minute he got home, he wanted to get married. So he and Lily got married. But they had the reception at our house because there was no places to have receptions. But my mother called in all these favours and had little things. But Wilf lived in Wallasey. Now, somehow his mother had thought that we lived just the other side of the docks. Well, we didn't by this time because we'd been bombed out and we'd moved out to Claughton Village. So she decided, and a couple of her neighbours would come to the wedding and they'd walk. Well, they walked all the way from Seacombe to our house in Claughton Village. And this poor old woman, I shouldn't tell you this, I really shouldn't tell you this. This poor old woman, she was a big fat woman and she'd walked and they didn't realise how far it was, but they arrived. And this poor fat woman was in absolute agony. And then they found out what the trouble was. She'd wiped the box. Well, you didn't have toilet paper, you couldn't get toilet paper. And she must have used a magazine, paper out of a magazine. And she was in absolute agony. And when she got to the bathroom, she found she'd got a staple. A staple of the magazine up her backside. Poor bugger had walked all the way from Seacombe. It's something that lives in your memory forever. This woman, well, wouldn't it?
Yes.
It would. Yes. But, oh dear me, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't have told you that. The poor woman was so happy she could almost dance when she... Anyway, we had plenty to eat. It was a big wedding. It was quite a big wedding, But that was one of the incidents in the war. And we had a couple of sheets as tablecloths, because we had no big tablecloths. We hadn't any tablecloth. So we had some sheets, And so they were the tablecloth. And we had this ox tongue and salad and the cake with the cardboard box on it.
Not the sort of wedding you'll forget in a hurry, by the sounds of things.
No, it wouldn't. No, you'd never forget it. You really wouldn't forget it.
You've just told a very funny story. Are there any sad stories that ought to be mentioned, do you think?
Well, the sad story was the whole area was bombed we lived in. There were no houses left. There was just rubble everywhere, street after street after street. But you must remember, we lived quite close on the docks. Not too near, but we lived near the docks. And there was nothing left, but there were 22 people killed in our road. I mean, that was terrible. But in the corner house, there was the Campbells lived. And there were 2 girls and 2 boys. 2 girls were much, much older than the 2 boys. And they'd had, the 2 elder daughters had dates with RAF blokes because they were stationed not far. And the 4 of them had gone to the pictures. But the sirens went and they came out. Eileen and Vera. And they decided, they had these 2 RAF boys with them, that they'd shelter. So they got in these brick shelters that were built in the corner of roads, you know. And one girl said, no, I'm getting home, I'm going home. So Vera and this RAF boy who was with her, and Eileen stayed behind and stayed in this air raid shelter. But Vera ran for it, and the lad with her. And they got home, they got in the brick air raid shelter in the mother's yard, and she was killed. The bomb came, well, they were landmines. And she and the boy were killed.
Oh dear.
It was sad. It was awful. My friend Maureen Conway, she was killed together with her mother and father. The Germans bombed our chippy.
That's disastrous.
It was. You heard the story of, what was his name? Was it John Bishop? You tell the story. The Germans, yeah. Well, on the corner, just round the corner, was the chippy. The Sherlocks lived there, Mr. and Mrs. Sherlock and a son and daughter. And of course, they'd had the fires going but they'd all gone under their stairs. Well, of course, this landmine came, and the Sherlocks were killed outright amongst the 22 that was killed there. There was truly, there was nothing left. They were going for the bombs, they were going for the docks, obviously, but they missed, and they got the whole area was completely bombed. You know, you accepted it. It wasn't, they dropped a bomb. No, it was just accepted as part and parcel of your life.
Yes.
And we went to school. Oh, I had the most awful gym slip. You could imagine, no pleats in it, it was awful. The clothing was awful because we had nothing. If you had something old that in your wardrobes, you could alter them. But we had nothing to alter. You understand? There was nothing there.
Yes.
And then my mother got, we were given tickets, coupons, utility coupons, and you could buy furniture with them. And utility furniture had 2 little half moons. Have you ever seen them?
Yes, I have, yes.
Yes. Well, what furniture we got had the half moons on, utility furniture. Well, it was better than nothing.
What did you do as a teenager during the war? Because you wouldn't have had many clothes.
We had no.
So what did you do if you were going out or anything?
You just wore your gym slip, that's all they had. You didn't have any clothes. I had the trousers that my mother had made and the top that she'd made for the Blitz, for the air raid shelters. And she'd got these extra coupons because we'd been bombed out. And she'd got a bit of a school uniform together for me, a gym slip with hardly any pleats in it. Gym slips had deep pleats, but mine didn't. He sat it out. And you wore that nearly all the time. You had no other clothes. I had no other clothes. And then they had this place that you could go down to, and it was all second-hand clothes. And you could buy that if you were bummed out, if you had the ticket. You could buy bits there. But there were, well, people weren't going to give the clothes up, were they? They'd have nothing either. They must have been very wealthy that gave up the clothes. But we got second-hand bits. Me knickers. Oh, God. I had 2 pair of knickers, navy blue. And so you had to wash one. Every night you'd wash a pair of knickers. Oh, God. Yes. And my blouse that I had was Tusha silk. It was very beautiful silk before the war. But it all had holes under the arms. And we had nothing to patch them with, you see. Oh, God. Yes, the clothing was a pretty rough. And I had a jacket with a zip-up, which the Americans had sent over. The Americans sent bundles of clothing over, and they were issued out to the churches. So the deaconess, Miss Barclay, in our church, she issued it. It was all issued from there. And if you're a favourite, you got some good stuff. But if you weren't a favourite, no. And I wasn't a favourite because my dad was the treasurer of the church and she was the deaconess. And she was always asking for things, and my dad would say, "Can't afford it, you can't have that." So she didn't like us. So we didn't get very much of her. But clothing was just, it was washed and put on, you know. You didn't have anything. And I made a nightie at school, it was my sewing thing. I only had the one nightie. God, it used to be washed and put on quick. This nightie I'd made in school. Yeah.
Yeah, now what about your aunties? What did they do?
Oh, yes, they were different. Now, Emma, my Auntie Emma, she worked at Littlewoods before the war. And they were kept on, and they made, it was all, the desk and everything were all, hundreds of girls worked there, you know. And they were all taken away, and sewing machines were brought in. And they made balloons, barrages, and parachutes. And she was an inspector, so she had big rubber things on her knees and a magnifying glass. And they used to crawl over these to check the sewing because people's lives were at risk. And the parachute material was lovely. Sometimes if they made a mess of a parachute, they'd let the girls buy it. And so we used to make underwear with lovely silk. It was lovely silk. We didn't get that very often. But she worked there. But they were given a pint of milk a day to drink because the balloon barrage material was like rubbery stuff on silk, but it was like a powder all over it. So it must have been, I don't know what it was, but they were all made to drink a pint of milk a day. So it must have been, that must have been pretty rough, whatever it was. But she worked there through the war. Now, my mother didn't have to work because she had Elsa's children, you know. Well, I was older than Pam.
What did Lily do?
Well, Lily worked. See, you had to do, if you had no children, you had to do war work. And she worked in a funny little place in Neston, which you had to get to every morning. And what they made it there was on big machines, wooden.
Saws.
You know, where you'd saw wood. And the wood they got was off American ships because they used to use them coming in with ballast. And these tatty woods used to be collected and taken out to this factory where the girls made these ammunition boxes and things. And at the end of the war, she was the only one with all her fingers.
Yeah.
The only girl in that factory with all her fingers. They had big saws, you know. And there was all kinds of horrible flies on this tatty wood that used to come in. And she was bit right in her eye here. She had a big iPad. And I don't really remember The violet ointment they used to have, it's like violet coloured. Do you remember? You wouldn't remember.
No, I
it,
don't
no.
remember that.
But this blooming purple ointment, people had scabies, because that was a lot of people had scabies. And you used to have to go down to this place at the swimming bath, the room at the side, and you got this purple stuff put on.
No,
It wouldn't wear off.
Wasn't called Bonnie's Blue, was it?
I don't know. No, it didn't have a name.
No.
It was just a purple ointment.
Right. Okay. There was something called Bonnie's Blue that I remember.
Well, that would
from
be
which
it. But it was purple.
Yes.
And they'd have them all over their fingers where the scabies was.
Mm.
And my husband, which of course was after the war, was in the RAF. And he got diesel on his ears. And he came home with all his ears purple. And he had a forage cap, you know, a forage cap. And he came home and all his ears were purple. And I'd gone to meet him at the train station. And he had this forage cap, big purple ears. But there you go. Everybody had purple on their hands. I didn't. But they had scabies. It was very rife.
Yes.
Very rife.
Where did you get your meat from in the war?
We got it from Bob the Butcher.
What about the extra?
Well, my mother used to give him 10 shillings a week. You always slip Bob 10 shillings. And we always got extra meat. We did very well for meat. Yes, and sausages and things.
What about the rabbits?
Oh, well, our houses were terraced houses, 3-bedroom terraced houses. And they had big entries that the waste people could get through, and horse and carts used to get through. And there used to be a horse and trap, you know, people could have sat in it, but they were from Hoylake, these people. And he used to go and fish with these carts. They'd take them out to sea now, and they'd get flukes, dabs, plaice actually. And they'd come up the back entry and they're shouting, "Fluix! Fluix!" They all shouted it like that, "Fluix!" And you'd go rushing out with a big plate or something, and you got a bucket for, you'd have them in buckets. You'd get a bucket of fish for half a crown. Oh, when you had to suck the bones, they were lovely. Really a treat when the fluke men came. The fluic. But further down our road, old Mr. Cartwright lived, and Mrs. Cartwright, but they were getting on. And he kept rabbits, and he had all these rabbit hutches against the yard wall. Loads of rabbits in them. And he'd say, "Do you fancy a bit of meat, Annie?" My mother'd say, "Oh yes, Mr. Cartwright." And Mr. Cartwright used to come down the back entry with a couple of rabbits. And we used to have rabbit pie. Oh, it was gorgeous. But Mr. Cartwright kept us, "Now, all right, Annie, I'll see you later." And he'd come down with a couple of rabbits. The things you did during the war, I mean, it was amazing, really.
Yes.
You know, you just accepted it. Now, there was another, my mother knew a girl who lived in Wallasey, whose husband used to go delivering stuff to farms. And she always had a dozen eggs to sell. 10 shillings you paid for a dozen eggs. I mean, that was a lot of money for a dozen eggs. But my father used to work night and day on the docks, keeping the docks going. And he had a bad tummy. So most of these eggs went to my father, whipped up with some milk, you know. And I used to have to go over to this woman's house in Wallasey on my bike. On my bike. Actually, it was my father's bike. I never had one of my own. And collect these dozen eggs. My God, I had to be careful coming across the railway lines, you know, in case it dropped, in case I got in the wheels in the railway lines. And pedal home with these damned eggs with my dad. At 10 shillings a dozen. But still, we've got them. My mother'd pay anything for it. My father used to be... He worked very funny hours. He worked... If there was a raid on it, he didn't get home until, you know, because they were keeping... He worked mostly in the Birkenhead Tower, because underneath the tower were the boilers. Now, they just got new boilers in before the war. from Belgium. And the damn things broke down time and time and time again. But they couldn't get spare parts because it was Belgium. So he was there most of the war repairing these damn boilers. It was a big thing. He'd get a phone call. I've got to get down there. The boilers are broken. Well, the boilers used to keep the water in the docks because Birkenhead, of course, is a tributary from the Mersey. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's right.
We came up. Well, you spent most of his war keeping them damn boilers going because they kept the water in the docks. We didn't see him an awful lot during the war, but he had this bad tummy, he had ulcers, so all these eggs used to be for my dad, you know? But we did all right in the war. My mother was a real black marketer. She was shocking. And Bert, the fellow that worked at the co-op, he'd ring her up and say, I've moved to so-and-so, I've taken your books to the food office, so you now... we'd be rationing somewhere else. But he always sent us the order. And sometimes there'd be a £56 box of butter or sugar. So my mother's family be all there, you know. Oh, she was a shock on my mother. We didn't go short of much, really. But we didn't have a house of the furniture that we had. It had all gone. And all our lovely china and stuff. It had all been my Granny Wolsey's, my dad's mother's. So it was lovely Crown Derby china and stuff. That all went, of course. It was.
Yes.
It all gone. We didn't have very much to start with at all. But we managed. We managed, and that was it.
What do you remember about the end of the war? VE Day came
The dancing.
along.
Well, I was 16, 17 then.
Yes.
And my friend Doreen Gray, we were given permission to go down to the square. But we ignored it to the Birkenhead. We went down to the big square, Hamilton Square, down by the town hall. And there's a big gardens in front of it. And everybody was dancing on it. And somebody, I don't know who, had rigged up this radio, this music. And we were all dancing, you know. My mother and dad didn't know where we were. Because we used to have to walk down there because we weren't allowed there. But Doreen Gray and I used to be down there. Now, her father had the Ford Escort, and it was at the bottom of the garden, and their garage at the bottom of their garden. And he couldn't use it because he had no petrol. If you went on a war work or anything, you didn't get coupons for petrol. So the damn thing the tyres all went jelly, you know. But we used to. He was a wide boy. Doreen's father. He ran a football coupon thing, and you had to count them in 50s. And these men used to come and he'd give them the tickets and they'd bring the money back and all that jazz. Nothing to do with us. But Doreen and I used to count the coupons on a Monday, and he'd give us a couple of bob. We'd go to the pictures. Now, we always used their back door down the bottom of the garden, and they had a greenhouse, and they grew grapes in it. So every time we went to pictures, we'd swipe a bunch of grapes to go to the pictures with, because my mother, I don't know what happened, we never got any sweet coupons at home. You could swap the sweet coupons for sugar, and she used to swap her sweet coupons for sugar. She was terrible. And her brothers were both in the army, as I told you. They were brought up as my brothers. They were in Dunkirk and then they were in Alamein. Chas drove a petrol tanker, but he followed the tanks. And Billy drove a Churchill tank. And he used to always say, oh, Charlie's not in the war, he only follows it in. Because the petrol houses used to follow because the tanks couldn't come back to be filled. They used to follow them in. But they both came home, and then they were in Dunkirk, and then they were in Alamein. They had a busy war, both of them, but they all came home. And my Uncle Vic came home from the Merchant Navy. Now, our Nell's husband, Jimmy, he was in the medical corps. And he was entrusted, he was in Crete, and he was entrusted with some very special papers to give to General Dryberg. And they were in the caves in Crete. And eventually they were taken off by submarine to Egypt. And he was mentioned in dispatches, you know, and he had a little oak leaf. Mm-hmm. And then he was a sergeant in the... But they couldn't increase his thing in the medical corps. So he turned over to the engineers and went to Octu, and he was the only man who'd gone to a normal school, an elementary school. All the other fellows on the course had all gone to public schools, you know. And mm-hmm. Jimmy came out the highest.
Wow.
He came out the highest in the class. But he was eventually made a major, but he had to transfer from the medical corps, and he went as an engineer. And his troop, when he came out of the Octu and as an officer, he had all Liverpool dockers. They were all, you can imagine what they were like, can't you?
Yes.
Yes. So they were in the first day, June the 6th, was it?
Yes.
He went in 6 minutes after the first ones, and they were taking equipment in, because it was no use being there if you didn't have... So Jimmy's Liverpool dockers went in 6 minutes after the first lot and took supplies in. They were all Liverpool dockers. He had a terrible time with them. And there was one day, they were put on parade for the Queen, and the King and Queen were coming. They chose his gang because they'd been in junkers that many times they could march. Yeah. So Jimmy's gang of Liverpool dockers were on parade marching because they'd done it that often. They're naughty boys. Yes, he loved them. He did. They were all really hard cases, but they were loyal. Now, he was in Egypt after the war. They were bringing in the old tanks and things out from the desert.
Yes.
But they had a load of Arabs working for them, helping get this war stuff back in. But they would go anywhere to go to the loo. They didn't care where they went. They wouldn't go anywhere twice. Mm-hmm. They always went. So he had a lot of problems with this, did Jimmy. And so he got his lads to make a big round wooden thing on a spindle. And it went round and round. And the Arabs had to go on there because they didn't know where they'd been before. But that was his effort for the war. Yes. We all survived it, and we all lived happy lives. I tell you what my mother used to have. My mother, if we were really pushed for food, we'd get salt fish. Do you know what salt fish is? Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, she had 3 flat salt fish hanging on a hook in the entrance to the air raid shelter. So if we got, she was short of nothing, she had nothing that we could give us for dinner, we'd have a salt fish. And we all loved it, I mean, you know.
Yes.
There was no doing us any harm. But my mother, as soon as she used one, she'd go, you could buy that, get another one and put it on the back of the hook. So the top one in the hook, you went. I mean, the things they did to make us, I can remember whipping. She used to make beautiful cakes, but she wanted cream. Well, you could get evaporated milk, and you'd have to whip it. My God, for hours you'd whip it and it'd go thick, and she'd put it in the cake. But she could just go in the kitchen and whip your cake up, no problem. But when you think about what we did eat, it didn't do us any harm. I mean, you just couldn't go out and buy. You could queue for hours for ordinary fish, but you could buy salt fish. And we liked it. So some days we'd have salt fish with mashed potatoes. It was a treat. You know,
Yes.
my sister and I never objected to it. But it's amazing what they did in the food line, what they made. You know, if they got a bit of, if the butcher had, like, you know, the fat they'd cut off meat, well, he'd give it a packet, she'd buy it. And he'd render it down slowly in the oven. And she'd get the fat from it.
Yes.
It was amazing, really. The food never bothered us. We always had something. And I do think it stood us in good stead. There was not, of course, you weren't allowed bananas or oranges or things like that. But if you had a green book and there were bananas in, you could get 2 bananas for a child under 5. But the others never got any. But my Uncle Vic, merchant neighbour, used to bring a big hand of bananas home. He'd buy them positively green,
Yes.
and by the time he got home, they were beginning to ripen. The war, I reckon, the war did us good in many ways. Like, we weren't allowed much sugar, and you had a sweet ration, and then you had a bread ration. You had to take, and then you had, at the back of the ration book, there were strips, and they were for tin food. If you got a tin of corned beef, oh my God, if you got a tin of corned beef, it did you a couple of meals. What they do with it, you know? Corned beef hash, things like that. We didn't do badly.
Tell us a little bit about after the war, just to sort of...
After the war,
Yes, I mean, you were 16 or thereabouts when the war finished.
yes. And I worked at Truman's.
Yes.
And the dockers went on strike because there was no beer. And so we had to lock ourselves all in the office. All doors had to be locked because they were hammering on the doors for beer. Yes, I worked at Truman's for quite a long time, but the wages were appalling. And the typewriter, oh my God, the typewriter I had. I think it must have been the First World War. It came in from the side. You know what I mean? And it came in from the side. I mean, I ask you.
Where did you meet your husband?
Well, I knew my husband when we were young. I used to go to music lessons. Not that it did me any good, it didn't. But it was next door to where Tony lived. And on a Saturday morning, we used to have to go for theory. And we weren't allowed to have a sweetie until the boy next door came in. And he had to hand the sweeties round. It was Tony next door. And I just think, oh God, here he is. He's right. But I knew him. And then you see at school I knew him. He was in a year younger than me. Because I think I'm 7 months older than Tony. And then we were both in Scouts. I was a cub leader in Arcala, and he was in Scouts. And we used to go camping at Overchurch, the Scout camp. And all his gang would be there. So we used to, mingle. And then we did a big pantomime. And he said to me, because we used to have to walk to the park home, and he said, I'll walk with you through the park. So he used to walk through the park with us. And then he'd go off. And then one Christmas he said, would you like to go to the pictures? And that was it. But I'd known him a long, long time. And then he went in the Air Force, of course. And we got engaged. Yes. Well, we married whilst he was in the Air Force. And I managed to buy a house. I'd saved upwards. Well, why we got married was because his mother, who they weren't short of a few bob, the Harwoods, they had a big pub and one thing and another, but his mother was tight. And she had claimed all his allotment, every penny of it. In fact, at one time he was only drawing 2 shillings a week because his mother had claimed all the other money. So he said to me, we were engaged, we might as well get married, he said. then you can claim my allotment. My mother, because he'd come home and said to his mum, how much have you saved for me, Mum? And she said, saved for you? I've saved nothing for you. So he came up very distressed and he said, I think we might as well get married, Beryl, because you can claim my allotment. So that's why we got married as early as we did. Otherwise we would have waited until he finished his national service. And I was then got his allotment, which I was able to save, and put as a deposit on the house, which did us a favour. But we weren't going to get married until he came out of the Air Force. But that's why we did get married. And then 3 years later, lady there came along and we had a baby. We were married in 1952 and she was born in 1955. So by that time I'd been able to save up and we had a home.
End of rationing by then.
1952 we were married. It was still on rationing. We had ration books still a couple of years.
That's right, yes.
And Tony used to come home from the Air Force and he'd bring his ration card, you know, and you'd get an ounce or 2 ounces of meat. It wasn't worth going for, you know. But he'd bring this little coupon thing home. It was 2 years or so until the rationing ended. But I was alone in the house, and so I didn't bother getting the meat because I'd save all my rations until Tom came home on leave because it was a bit of fillet steak or something, you know, it wasn't worth collecting.
No.
So I used to save them up until Tom came home and he'd bring this little coupon thing, 2 ounces of meat. 2 ounces of meat, what could you do with it? 2 ounces of meat. So he used to bring his coupons home, so I'd save mine, and Bob the butcher would give me some fillet steak then, because Tone was home. Yes. But you see, he really was quite lucky in that respect, because the money I got, I saved hard, and we were able to buy a house, which was a blessing, because people were living in rooms everywhere. There was no property.
Yes.
And then they started building 1 or 2 houses. But it was an old house I bought.
That's all right.
Singing. They both go together, you know. One starts the other off.
Yes. So let's just go back a little bit, because you didn't say very much, I think, about your parents. It's going back into the into the past. Do you remember much about your mother and father?
Oh yes. My mother came from a big family, and I was more or less brought up with them. So I was always like the little sister.
Yes.
Like Lily was only like 6 years older than me. Do you understand?
Yes.
So I was brought up with my granny's family as well as my brothers and sisters. They were not, we used to fight like hell. And my granny had a kitchen and a big shed on the end. And she used to have hooks in the ceiling and she had baskets hanging on them. And we close the doors and get in the kitchen, in the back kitchen, the shed thing, and get a basket each, and we'd fight with the baskets. And she'd play out because the handles would be loose, you know.
Yes, yes.
But as a child, they were tormented, because I was the youngest, obviously. Well, it was my sister, but she was much younger. We had a happy home. My dad was always a difficult man. And if you played drafts with you or Ludo, he had to win, you know? So you fought a hard game. We all fought a hard game because we'd try and beat my dad.
Right.
But he had no sense of humour, my dad.
No.
It was very hard work.
Had he fought in the First World War?
No.
No.
And he didn't fight in the Second World War because of his reserved occupation. He was the foreman engineer. So he didn't fight he wasn't old enough to fight in the First War.
No.
And my dad was 64 when he died. But my mother died first, she was only 57.
Mm.
And my father died. My father got married again. And it was to a person my mother disliked intensely.
Oh dear.
So he sent me a birthday card. And it said, from Dad and Louise. And he spelt Louise, Lousie, lousy. So guess what she was called?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, lousy. And when he was very poorly, we knew he had cancer actually, because he smoked like I don't know what. And we went to see him, and she said, wait in the dining room and I'll let you know when it's ready to go upstairs to him. You know, she was like that, his second wife. So we went upstairs to see my dad, and he said, I wouldn't be like this, you know, if your mother had been alive. And I said, why? He said, your mother would have had me up and out and done, and it'd have been better. And we knew that Louise was on the landing listening. It was funny, really.
Yes. Yes.
But he'd married her, so we could do nothing about it.
No, absolutely.
And at the funeral, his funeral, her brother came across to my sister and I, and he said, well, it's nice meeting you. He said, but there is no need now or ever to call again to my sister. She has nothing to do with you, and she has nothing at all to do with you. So fine. So I said, I accept that, no problem. But my mother-in-law and father-in-law lived in 35, and my mother and father lived in number 5. You know? So it was very difficult. It was difficult. We started not coming in that side of the avenue, because it was my mother's curtains up, and do you understand?
Yes.
It was very difficult. But one day, Katie, my youngest, was staying with her grandma and grandpa in 35. And she went and knocked on the door, and she said, Louise, can we have my Nana's pictures, please? My mummy would like them. Because on my mother's tall boy in the bedroom, it was dozens of photograph frames of the children, you know? And she used to call it a rogues gallery. So Katie was only little, she was about 6. And she was staying with Queenie and Leslie, you know, my parents-in-law. And she said, oh, she said, she wants the photographs of Nana's bedroom. So she said, oh, wait a minute. And she brought a cardboard box. It was a Sunlight soap box, I can remember it now, a cardboard box. And it was full of photographs. No frames, just photographs. And she said, and while I'm here, can I have my jug? And she said, what do you mean? She said, I've got a jug that I used to have lemonade in. So she said, oh yes, I know the one you mean. Well, my mother had a tiny little cream jug, and it was shaped like a thistle. And she used to give it to kids with lemonade in, you know, and they'd play house with this. So she gave her the little cream jug. So we still got that, it's in the other room. And the photographs we got, and that's all we got. Now, I desperately would have liked the copper kettle. It was in the hearth. And in the bottom of the copper kettle was 5 or 6 medals that my granny's brothers had brought home from the First World War. And my granny, and they'd given them to us, their sister, Sarah Ann. And she'd put them in the copper kettle. So when my mother got the copper kettle, they were still there. So, do you understand? Now, eventually, the copper kettle lid went missing. How in God's name a copper kettle? We didn't know. Nobody knew anything about it. Nobody knew anything about the lid of the copper kettle. So it had no lid for a long, long time. And then my auntie, she was my auntie was a fanatical cleaner. She used to scrub the backyard. You know, she was ridiculous. And she found this wire and she said, "I've been wondering what this wire is. It comes from the back bedroom." And it went in the grid. And she heaved the damn thing up. And on the end of it was the acorn of the top of the copper kettle lid. The lid had all disintegrated. The boys had made a cat's whisker upstairs in the back bedroom. And they needed an earth or something.
An aerial, yes.
So they'd got the copper kettle and put wire on it and in the grid. And so all it was the acorn off the top of the lid left. So my father went to work and they had they had all kinds of things to the work. It was dockboard and they had copper shop and a fitter's shop and you know what I mean. So they made him a new lid and put the acorn on top. So my granny gave us the kettle. So we had the kettle with the medals in the hearth. And it meant so much, do you understand? Because we used to laugh, you know. And then when Sally was born, and she used to play my mother's, you know, and she always put the balls that she was playing with in the copper kettle. Now I'd have liked the copper kettle. We didn't get anything else. But we had got the little jug that Kate had asked for, and we had the photographs. And then she lived in the house. My dad died, and she lived there for quite a while. And then when she died, it was emptied, and within 3 weeks the house was up for sale. Amazing. Everything had gone. Well, probably our nieces and nephews, whatever had happened to it, I don't know. But we didn't get anything. But I would have liked the copper kettle.
How would you sum up your life? Was it a happy life by and large, or?
It was happy and unhappy at times. My father was not a cruel man. He would think nothing of giving you a punch. He had no sense of humour, and my mother did. She was a jolly person. How she put up with him, I don't know. I used to think when I was getting older, why doesn't she leave him and take us with her somewhere? But she never did. And he was full of grace and cock of the north, you know. Lovely clothes. He always had nice clothes. My mother bought them. But he was hard to live with. He had no sense of humour. I always remember he always gave the dog a cup of tea at night before he went to bed, in a bowl. Sometimes, and anyway, one night he was out at one of his lodge meetings, and I gave the dog a cup of tea in his pint pot. And when he came in, he went to make himself a cup of tea, and I said, "Wash that cup out, Dad." And he said, "What for?" And I said, "Because I've given the dog a cup of tea in it." Oh, he went mad. Because he used to say, "Dogs are cleaner than humans. Dogs are cleaner than..." He used to always go on, you know. Oh, and I ran up the stairs quick and locked the bedroom door. He'd have killed me. You know, I mean, I did it on purpose, you know, because he was a difficult man to live with.
What would you say was the happiest moment of your life?
My wedding day.
Right.
And the day the baby was born. My life with Tony was happy.
Yes.
On my wedding day,
Yeah.
I shouldn't tell you this really, we were going along in the car, the wedding car, and I was very well known in the village, and there was a lot of people out waving to me from the shops, you know. And he said to me, "Now this is your last chance. This is your last chance. If you don't want to get married, now's your last chance." And I looked at him and I said, "Dad, I'd have married anybody to get away from you." And he said, "What? What?" I said, "I'm telling you the truth. I'm just so glad it's Tony Harwood and I love him." He never forgave me, of course. Well, I wouldn't expect him to, but it was true.
Yes. I'm going to have to finish at that point, Beryl, but thank you very much indeed.
I haven't really told you much about the war, but...
Oh, you have. You've told us plenty. You have, you really have. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for thinking of me.
No?